Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 24th of January 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, Mike Robinson. Very wet, unpleasant day here.
Absolutely. Not so wet. Well, maybe wet in another sense in Davos, but lots of snow there, of course, continuing snow. This is the cybersecurity session which was going on in Davos today. We have Rob Wainwright there from Europol, the only Brit on the panel as far as I know. What was he saying? He's saying cybersecurity risks are increasing. This follows on from the discussion that he had yesterday at the same event, about data being shared between government and private interests. But today he was saying that cybersecurity risks are increasing. WannaCry is an example of that. Critical banking services, critical banking infrastructure being in the firing line as criminals act in a targeted way, he's saying. And he said that state-sponsored and criminals are intermixing, state-sponsored activity and criminal activity intermixing, but apparently they are finding ways to fight back. And so they've set up a global cybersecurity center. Now, this is the response to it, a global cybersecurity center. It's a way of building best practice, apparently. And he said, we need to stay within the law, but we must monitor the dark web and look for intelligence on targets. There is a way to protect companies and stay within the law, apparently. Of course, one of the ways that Britain has found to make sure that intelligence services stay within the law and the police is to simply legislate, making something which happened for many years legal when it was previously illegal. We mentioned that Theresa May has failed to do that in certain areas, but in other areas we've seen that already.
Yeah, but remarkable though, we have an agency which just has to reassure us that they're going to do everything legally.
Yes.
We wouldn't do anything that was,
Yeah, indeed. A big topic at Davos today has been, could 2018 be the year of the next financial crisis? This has been extra comment has been made on the sidelines to various media. This from the Telegraph, Ambrose Evans-Pritchard, of course, at Davos, saying world finance now more dangerous than in 2008. The quote from William White, who's head of the OECD's review board, and he's a former chief economist at the Bank for International Settlements. He said central banks are now caught in a debt trap. They cannot keep holding interest rates near zero as global inflation pressures build, because that will lead to an even more perilous financial bubble. But they cannot easily raise interest rates either, because it risks blowing up the system. So he's saying that collapse is inevitable as a result of quantitative easing. So the system is more dangerous than ever, certainly more dangerous than it was in 2008. He said all the market indicators might now look very similar to what we saw before the Lehman crisis, but the lesson has somehow been forgotten. So this adds on to what Patrick was talking about yesterday. And then we have this, because this is the chief executive of one of Russia's leading banks, Andrei Kostin from VTB Bank, this notionally close to Vladimir Putin, and he was interviewed by the Financial Times at Davos, and he said, well, we're really looking at a growing threat of European military conflict because of the financial situation. He said that we're beginning to see a new arms race. NATO is asking for more weapons and spreading more weapons in Europe, and Russia will retaliate absolutely the same. So who will benefit from this? Only the generals and those who produce arms. America is saying Europe should pay more for this. Who needs it? It's very dangerous. He said that VTB and Sberbank, the two biggest Russian banks, are both majority owned by the Russian government, and they fear that the US could try to exclude them from the SWIFT international interbank payment system, which could severely restrict their cross-border activities. And so on. Any economic sanctions against institutions, personally, I would say this would be like declaring a war I see no reason why the Russian ambassador should stay in Washington any longer after that, or the American ambassador should continue swimming in cold water in Moscow. And so it went on. So the Russians raising alarm bells as well.
It's quite incredible what's being fomented here. That's the correct word, I think, Mike. We are seeing a rapid push to escalate the path to conflict in Europe. Bankers joining in, Davos joining in, the army, which we'll come back onto in a minute.
And of course, as we mentioned yesterday, the issue of inequality between the richest and the poorest also on the agenda. In parallel with reports from Oxfam, as we mentioned yesterday. Well, today Christine Lagarde was giving a presentation, and she's suggesting that there should be a wealth tax to bridge the gap between the poorest and the richest. Does that sound like a good idea to you?
Mike, nothing this woman says is a good idea as far as I'm concerned. I did watch the news yesterday, and when I saw this woman's face coming up, how is this woman still standing on the international stage telling other people what to do with the track record of the, I think Patrick described it as she'd sidestepped the accusations against her. But around her, what do you see? Massive corruption. And she's still free, and now she's lecturing the rest of us on how to run the world.
Well, indeed, she said that while the incomes of working age Europeans have stayed stagnant since 2008, those of older people have risen by 10%. So we've got to start hating old people because, well, pretty soon we've got to start killing them off.
It's happening already, Mike.
Absolutely. So she said that while youth unemployment spiked to 25% in 2013 across Europe, 20% in this category are still looking for work. And she said that the Brexit referendum was an example of the generational divide, apparently. I'm not quite sure how she comes to that conclusion. So she then called for this tax and for labour market reform. She said any finance minister is going to first of all think about the efficiency of collecting revenue and serving a budget that's going to be sustainable and healthy. But the second aspect of taxation is also redistribution. And she said that there's not much incentive for young people to take part in modern democracies if they have the certainty that their dreams will be deferred at best and buried at worst. It seems that we are to be in conflict with each other, whether we're male, female, or young or old. It doesn't really matter.
That is the plan, Mike. That is the divide and rule plan. If you can have everybody at each other's throats, then of course everybody can be manipulated.
And of course today at the World Economic Forum we have the issue of fake news versus real politics. And this is a session sponsored by BBC. It's called the BBC World Debate. And their session, Fake News versus Real Politics, examined what can be done to protect democracy in the so-called post-truth world. It had Jimmy Wales from Wikipedia. Of course, he set up a new media outlet, which is supposed to be the media outlet of media outlets, a Wikipedia-style creation. Joseph Kahn, who's managing editor of the New York Times, Anna Belinka, deputy editor and chief of RT, and it was hosted by Zainab Badawi from the BBC. So that's good. They pushed out a nice little infographic, how to spot fake news. And the first two items on that are to consider the source and to check the author. But of course, we've already discovered recently, Brian, that we can't check the author with regard to BBC articles because they don't often publish the name of the author.
But they did tell us, Mike, the reason for that is because everybody can trust the BBC, and therefore you can trust any journalist that writes or produces for the BBC. So they don't need to name their journalists because everybody trusts the BBC, except, of course, we now know from that wonderful survey that the Daily Mail kindly printed that 83% of Britons do not trust the BBC. So £3.74 billion of BBC government propaganda machine, and that's what the survey discovered, that 83% of Britons did not trust the BBC. Yep. So this is in itself fake news.
Okay, well, let's go back to this just for a second, because the third one there is check the date. Well, this is very important, and Vanessa Bailey will know what I'm talking about if she's watching. Check your biases. We have to check our own biases because this helps us identify fake news. We've got to read beyond the headlines. We've got to check for supporting sources. We've got to decide whether it's a joke.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, a little bit later in today's news, we're going to focus in on an article that the BBC got involved in, and we could apply these rules as we go through, Mike. I think it'll be interesting.
And you've also got to ask the experts. So you've got to ask the experts because you might want to go to Snopes or some other website, which is a fact-checking website. Full Fact, perhaps you want to go to because they're better at identifying facts than other media outlets.
Yeah. It's nauseating.
I'm being sarcastic. Of course, the Ask the Experts one, I think that's quite interesting, bearing in mind the new program that Demos has begun, really wondering why people have lost confidence in the experts. So maybe that's giving us a clue. So consider the source and check the author. These are the two most important things they say to stop fake news. So I just want to bring people's attention to this because Patrick Henningsen and I attended this meeting last night. At Plymouth University, a UK column member came with us. It was quite an interesting meeting. It was entitled Analysing Sentiment Expressed on Social Media by Political Audiences. And what they were doing was showing research that the university was doing using big data and to look at audiences on Twitter and try to work out if they could identify the sentiment expressed or how people were viewing particular items, and they were looking at Trump and Brexit and so on, and the general election. The issue of fake news came up, and what was absolutely clear was that what they were intending to do, the methodology they were intending to use, was that they were going to compare the results they got, or at least take some guidance in order to develop their research based on people that they viewed to be a gold standard. And of course, the point there then is, who are they going to choose as the gold standard? Are they going to choose the BBC and The Guardian and these types of organisations? And are they going to say that anybody that isn't the BBC and The Guardian is fake news? That comes back to this infographic, check the author and check the source.
Yeah. So what were the findings of this?
Well, I mean, based on where they're at the moment, it's pretty clear that it is not possible using machine learning and using AI at this point in time, particularly the narrow AI that they were talking about. It isn't possible to identify people's sentiment and people's reactions to what's going on in the media. And it certainly isn't possible to identify fake news using these automated processes.
Right, so they're probably quite worried about that.
I don't know. I mean, they're looking at it purely from an academic standpoint. I don't know whether they have a personal opinion. They certainly didn't express one.
Right. Well, let's just stay on Davos, and we'll come back to the BBC because the BBC feels that ordinary people just really aren't capable of taking in the language that's used at Davos. So they've labelled it here, Davos jargon, a crime against the English language. And there's the lady looking extremely puzzled. She doesn't understand it. It's all too complicated for her. So the BBC has come in. They've given a little bit of information about the World Economic Forum, mainly that it's taking place in the snow. It's very snowy there, Mike. There's a little bit of hot air in the meeting rooms, but they're using English that people don't understand. So to help, we, the BBC, have compiled a short list of bewildering terms and phrases overheard or read at Davos. And encourage people to go and have a look at this article. We've got nice little cartoon figures. This is circularity, which it describes, and then it talks about influencers and leaders, but it's all done in an amazingly childish thing. There is not one serious piece of investigative journalism as to what is actually taking place at the World Economic Forum and why we have people there involved in corruption. We have big business alongside politicians. Nothing of any worthwhile journalism at all. This is a planted article which is designed to make, those silly people in those hotel rooms in the Davos gathering. So I'm going to label this one dangerous fake news because, of course, it's drifting people's minds away from the key topics that they should be paying attention to.
Well, another piece of fake news today from The Guardian, Last Men in Aleppo review, grueling portrait of a city without hope. This is Firaz Fayyad's heartbreaking documentary, apparently, which offers powerful insights into the courageous rescue work of the White Helmets volunteers, of course. Now, of course, with the awareness of what the White Helmets actually are, the comments started appearing below this article. But very quickly, unfortunately, after only 37 comments had been made, comments, it turns out, were not free once again, and comments were closed.
Yeah.
But The Guardian being called out for fake news, but they don't want to hear it.
No, but what they are showing us very clearly is what we can do to actually, hurt these people in an IT sense. Because if people get in, challenge the journalists they challenge the journalists directly, make these comments, every time one of these newspapers has to shut this down, they're admitting they can't cope with what the real public sentiment is. So people should be encouraged by this. More comments posted on the media and the press websites. That's the way to do it. Right, well, let's bring in this one, since we just dropped back to Syria there. But apparently British men prepare to fight Turkish-led forces in Syria. The BBC's got one of its amazing articles, Mike, because they've apparently talked to one of the fighters. And they've also talked to another individual. They've talked to Michael Stevens, a Middle East analyst from the Royal United Services Institute. Now, that came up yesterday. I say to people, if you don't know what this organisation is, you need to go and look at it, because it's never been elected, but it's setting UK defence policy. But Michael Stevens said previously their actions had aligned completely with the goals of the coalition partners. But now they're actually taking on a sovereign country and a NATO ally, and this brings up certain legal considerations. So, if we can just paraphrase that a bit, previously these mercenaries worked for us, the UK and USA. That was good. Now they're that should be their own decisions and fighting Turkey, and of course that's bad, and we've got to stop it.
Yes.
So who would be the man making all of these excellent comments? Well, let's bring in Michael himself. It's very interesting to have a look at his background here, because it basically says he's a research fellow for the Middle East Studies and head of RUSI Qatar. He joined RUSI's London office in September 2010, first in the nuclear security program. So you jump in as an intern straight into nuclear security. Fascinating. But here's the key bit. From March to June 2017, Michael was seconded into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, serving as the senior research analyst for Syria and Lebanon. So my comment is, who is this man exactly? Where did he come from? And why has he got this astonishing power within the British government? So unelected, but now helping to sort out policy. Clearly a little bit worried that fighters would go against the OK coalition line. And I'm kicking myself a little bit, Mike, because I wanted to bring in a copy of the Mail on Saturday, where I read the front page with the headline there, Putin is a clear and present danger. I know you covered this yesterday, but I wanted to say when I read this article, it was appalling. I have never read such drivel by a senior British military officer, concocted propaganda against the Russians. One of the major inset articles said that those nasty Russians had used the fighting to test weapons. And I want to say, with as much dripping sarcasm as possible, of course, we never do that sort of thing. We never go into combat and test weapons. No.
That's a bit of sarcasm there.
Bit of sarcasm.
Yeah.
And what was the general doing with his other senior officers when, over the many years, of course, where the Russians were rebuilding their military using Russian workers, Russian industry, Russian finance? Where was he? So we've seen the military ripped apart here in UK, and then this man stands up and speaks at a RUSI event. Not Westminster, not in front of a Defence Select Committee. He's talking at RUSI. This is propaganda.
Well, the Russians have, TASS is reporting that the 5th generation fighter has started flying in Russia. This is the Russian equivalent of the F-35, I suppose you could say. Cutting edge weaponry is how they say it, is how they describe it. Tense work is underway. The entire set of precision weapons for this aircraft, both inside the fuselage and on an external sling, is being developed by various enterprises. We have switched to practical flights, and I believe that will see the result in the imminent future. I suspect that this aircraft will not be attempting to kill its own pilots by switching off the oxygen supply. And I wonder if it would be worthwhile doing a comparison of the costs of developing this aircraft versus the F-35.
We really don't have to, Mike, because there's a lot of financial information about, and of course one of the things that it shows very clearly is that the Russians are producing these immensely capable aircraft at a fraction of the cost that's going on in the West. And that must be, of course, because of the obscene profits that are being made by companies like Lockheed Martin, which are just feeding off other countries.
Just briefly, NATO saying that ships from NATO have entered the Black Sea, Brian, including Royal Naval ships. So clearly, at least we've got something out at sea at the moment.
Well, good luck to them. I think if it gets much tenser, Mike, they're going to be in a very dangerous position there. But this is designed to antagonise the Russians. If we had Russian ships coming up the Irish Sea or something, this would be all over the media. This is the British government using the military to provoke, in my opinion. No question of it.
Right. Now, David Davis, the so-called Brexit Minister, was speaking to the Commons Brexit Committee this morning, and he was talking about trade. And he said that the CETA agreement, the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, is not enough for Britain. Apparently, we want to do something more than that. We want to take some aspects of CETA that we like, and we want to do some other bits that aren't necessarily in CETA already. So we won't adopt every piece of the deal, is how some people were describing it. He said that there are many good aspects to the agreement, good templates that we might want to use. He said that Britain is going to keep negotiating trade deals with other countries after the so-called transition period starts, and we'll talk about that in a second. So he said that he expects to continue talks on trade provisions during the transition period, and he said that during that period, Britain will remain under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, of course. So he said he was relaxed about the transition period because his main concern is the future relationship, partnership between the UK and the EU. And of course, as we know from Theresa May, that's going to be of greater breadth and greater depth than anything we've ever seen before. He said that although no specific meetings to discuss the transition agreement had yet been set up, that he was expecting the transition agreement to be done within the next 8 weeks. So we haven't had any meetings about it yet. But it's all going to be done and dusted within the next 8 weeks, and we're going to know exactly what the transition period is going to be all about. We don't know what we're transitioning to, but we're going to know what the transition period is going to be all about.
Yeah, but
which is basically that we're going to stay as we are. Nothing's changing over that transition period, right?
Yeah, I think you're being a little harsh on him, Mike, because to be, Brexit without the exit minister must be a tough job.
Well, it must be. And he was asked what he thought would be difficult parts of the transition deal, and he said that he thought that there would be arguments around issues such as outside negotiations on trade deals with other EU countries. Now, of course, what Britain seems to be saying at the moment is that, we're going to leave the EU, but we're going to have a trade deal between ourselves and the EU. and then we're going to continue to trade with all the other countries that also have trade deals with the EU as if we were in the EU.
Yeah.
Well, there's only one way that that's possible. That's if we're actually in the EU, even though we've come out in name only, right?
Yeah, but of course that's what Brexit without the exit means.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he was asked about how long any transition period might be, and as close as he was willing to get was about 2 years, maybe, perhaps.
Okay, perhaps. Well, what a great time to introduce Henry Bolton of UKIP. And I was a little bit naughty because I took a peek inside his head and I thought he was saying this. When I'm not thinking of 25-year-old ladies, I might give a bit of my time to helping UKIP. But why anyone would not want a fine man like me as leader, I just can't understand. I'm trustworthy, reliable, and I've also done great work for the EU. So there he is, and I think we've now got about 16 people in UKIP have resigned. Cartoons showing empty UKIP conference halls. What has happened here, Mike, is at the time 17 million people who voted to come out of the EU should be contacted, they should be encouraged, supported. Of course, they're capable of raising a lot of money, but those 17 million voters should now be focused to challenge this nonsense over Brexit. What has happened? Henry Bolton, I say, with the connivance of Nigel Farage, have utterly destroyed the public image of UKIP. This has got to be deliberate. This cannot be an accident. And this man standing there refusing to go, and the reason he's refusing to go is the longer he stays on, the more damage he can do to UKIP. Now, I always get some feedback when we discuss UKIP. I have great, I'm a big supporter of much of the good work that UKIP people have done. Many UKIP people support the UK column. However, we need to be blunt. Let's come on to Nigel Farage. And we'll have a look at what this man has actually been saying. I chose Sky News. Nigel Farage claims UKIP could be worthless in 18 months. Here he is grinning and laughing whilst he's predicting. And why can he predict? Because he knows perfectly well UKIP was never to be allowed to do any real damage. I think they were shocked at the referendum. So what sort of things did he say? Well, let's bring up this one. Regardless of whether Bolton wins or not, this is now about more than Henry Bolton. This thing is now an amateur shambles. It doesn't work at virtually any level. This is the chance to put fundamental reform in place to get a party where a leader can actually lead. If it goes on being run by a group of amateurs within 18 months, it will be worthless. But this was the leader, Mike. This was the leader who, when he said Brexit was achieved, I'm leaving politics, he then ran away to help Trump.
Yes.
This man is duplicitous, he's dangerous. And then he goes on, will Henry Bolton succeed? Will he fail? Is he good enough? I don't know. So even now, apparently, Farage can't make up his mind about what sort of man Henry Bolton is. Nigel Farage, I have said for years, would destroy UKIP. And of course, UKIP is now being taken apart from the inside at just the time it should be bringing those 17 million Brexit people together.
Okay, Carillion, the government has announced that there are no guarantees past the end of January. So 20,000 people working in the UK, it's not clear what's going to happen to them after the end of the month. We all know we'll be paid until January, but beyond that, it's unclear. Somebody said to the Financial Times, I believe it was, and that was at their head office in Wolverhampton, 450 people are employed. He said, it's just as well we get paid this month. There's lots of us with Christmas bills to pay, but who knows what happens after that. So the government's saying that there are no plans for layoffs from January the 31st, but said that they couldn't guarantee how many employees would be kept on or for how long. But it's okay because the job centres are all ready. There's an emergency response team there. Job centres are ready to help anybody that has been affected by this, so nobody needs to worry, apparently.
Okay.
Good. Well, the Mirror here reporting that Labour is going to use Brexit papers plan to force ministers to come clean on Carillion PFI deals. So basically what's this about? The parliamentary rules that were used to force the government to publish documents over Brexit are going to be used to try to get them to publish details of the PFI contracts and how those contracts were awarded. So they're attempting to force ministers to release these details, particularly of any risk assessments carried out before awarding contracts to Carillion, as well as any plans they had to improve those risk assessments. So we will wait and see whether that tactic succeeds.
Well, it's an interesting, we'll call it a bit of a muddle, Mike. Nobody quite knew what Carillion was up to. Interesting tweet I picked up here, pointing out PricewaterhouseCoopers are now in the mix. So one of the big auditing companies, it says they advise Carillion's pension trustees on its financial difficulties, but they also advise the government on what to do if Carillion collapsed. And they're handling the liquidation now that it has collapsed. So not to worry, because they're in bed with the company, they're in bed with the government, they're in bed with the liquidation. Why did I pick up on PricewaterhouseCoopers? Because, of course, we'd been pointing out that it was KPMG, the other massive auditing company that was working with Carillion. So let's put PricewaterhouseCoopers in the mix. Well, what have we got here? Well, I said at the time, transparency, separation of powers, absolutely none whatsoever. So have we got a government, or are we simply just looking at a government which is run by the corrupt banks and corrupt big businesses? I think that's closer to the truth.
Now, something we've been talking about for quite some time is the issue of charging on Britain's roads, not just specific roads with tolls, but charging generally. And this is ACE. ACE seems to be a business association, so lots of construction companies, people involved in infrastructure work, providing support for this organisation and making up this organisation. So they've produced a report saying that motorists should be charged for using the roads network based on personal circumstances. So, for example, whether a driver's journey was on motorways or country lanes, the time of day, how much congestion is on the network, but also drivers' financial circumstances, whether they're students, pensioners, unemployed. They said that relying on money that was raised through fuel duty and the road tax and also the HGV levy is no longer appropriate. It's out of date. They said the growing uptake of zero-emission vehicles means that revenue from vehicle excise duty and fuel duty will continue to decline as a percentage of UK's GDP in the future. So really we need to start charging for that. So, as I say, this is ACE is an association of businesses that are involved in infrastructure delivery. But who are their partners? Well, it's the Department for International Trade. So there you go. Anyway, no government involvement in that report, perhaps, at all?
No, not at all. And we'd just say to people, perhaps you might like to trawl back through the UK column news of many years ago when Mike and I were talking about the massive disruptions to Britain's motorways. Why was that happening? Of course, because all of the fibre optics for road charging, those huge cross motorway gantries were going in. That was all the infrastructure going into place. We had no money for the NHS, no money for schools, no money for defence, billions being spent on this road infrastructure. And that was the preparatory infrastructure, of course, for road charging, which now is coming along.
And I suspect eventual privatisation.
Indeed. And let's remember that it was the Rothschild banking dynasty that said they would be quite happy to buy Britain's roads. Well, change of subject. The local Plymouth newspaper, the Plymouth Herald, has reported that the former naval officer Charles Howson is going to be sentenced for 10 assaults. That's on the 2nd of February this year.
Sexual assaults on young men, is that right?
Of young men, yeah. Indeed. But he's also going to be retried on 2 charges which the jury couldn't agree with last time. I'm going to say at this point that at the moment, while the trials go on and sentencing is coming up, we certainly can't talk in any detail around this, but an amazing case. And I know there are many people who would like more comment from me personally. And I have to say at the moment, until the legal process is over, we are, of course, restricted in what we can say, but sentencing on the 2nd of February. Well, let's come back to the BBC via the Financial Times. And here's the headline: Men only inside the charity fundraiser where hostesses are put on show. So this is the Financial Times article. I have to say this young lady here did catch my eye. I don't know about you, Mike. I don't know whether you think she's appropriately dressed to be out in the evening with a great deal of men. What is she wearing? Well, this was part of the advice for this fundraising event by the President's Trust. So it's already caused great furore because, of course, what this is to do with is men in suits touching up innocent young ladies. This is the story that the Financial Times is putting across, and it's now got that we're calling for tougher laws after women groped at charity gala. We're not after tougher laws to bring child abusers to book, but now we can see that men in suits are touching up women. It's spreading all over the place. The President's Club, sorry, I think I said the Trust, the President's Club, hostesses groped and propositioned, and everybody's stunned about this. And this lady is the Financial Times journalist who wrote the story. Miss Marriage is apparently her name. Mm-hmm. And she was really shocked. She told Ewan Davis that she was one of 130 women hired as hostesses at the men-only event, and that she'd been warned the men might be annoying, but she described being groped several times. And we picked up on this because it says a spokeswoman for one of the beneficiaries of the President's Club auction, Great Ormond Street Hospital Children's Charity, said, due to the wholly unacceptable nature of the event, we're returning previous donations and will no longer accept gifts from the President's Club Charitable Trust. Now, this is fascinating because in this lady's article, which we're going to gently label dangerous fake news, she doesn't really get into this subject at all. You're led to believe that this group of men run a charity and they've given a bit of money to the Great Ormond Street Hospital. Well, we'll come on to that because we've done our research. Here she is. Here's her Twitter page, and she's pushing on other tweets. Amazing reporting by Miss Marriage in her excellent piece on the sordid underbelly of the macho London charity circuit. So it's a charity circuit. It's all about men. It's a bit dirty. She's done a good job. And, of course, the BBC straight onto it. And Evan Davis, I don't know, if you watch this video clip, Mike, he was almost slavering with interest about what she had to say about being touched up and hands up skirts and things. He says this to her at one point: is that not what you thought you were going to get? A bunch of drunk rich men who are going to grab you? I think he was getting pleasure out of this interview, and I'm going to say it. That's what I picked up. Other people can watch it. But this is an interesting point because what did this young lady think she was getting into? Well, we'll just say this on Ewan Davis. This is his Twitter page. And if you look down bottom left, he says that these are my views. The BBC has no views. I thought that was a very interesting comment, Mike, because I think he's absolutely right. Or is it that the BBC has views, but they're government policy views? I don't know, but there's his book, because he's boasting that in May he's got a book coming out, Peak Bullshit Post-Truth. So presumably that whole book is going to be about the BBC.
You would have thought so, yeah.
Well, let's have a look at the President's Club. You need to see this yourself, because aside from the one charity mentioned, Great Ormond Street, this is just some of the children's charities that they help fund. It goes on and on and on, far too many for me to show on screen. So why doesn't the FT and the BBC say that this club of men doing pretty unpleasant things, including getting parts of their anatomy out in public, are apparently the people who are helping children's charities? I get an uneasy sense here, Mike.
Well, just to clarify, the event was run by the President's Club, but the people that were attending weren't President's Club staff.
Oh, indeed not. Big business, politicians.
Yeah,
yeah,
all kinds. But yes,
yeah.
Politicians. But
yeah.
we haven't had any comments from politicians yet about what their activities were. Is that
no,
right?
This is true. But the President's Club did organise the event, and therefore the style of the event. This is some of the links through to another charity, the TBAP Foundation. We've got Esther Ranson in here. Danny Kruger, interesting, the man who said the Conservatives were going to destroy public services. So nothing about protection of children, but all of these people apparently helping children's charities. Well, we've poked a little finger at Mr. Davies saying to the lady, did she know what she was getting into? She went through this recruitment agency, Artista, who are recruiting the girls to attend this event. And you don't have to be on the website very long before you get a rough idea of what they're after.
Yeah.
I don't know how old these individuals, these girls are, because you can't see their faces, but this is the sort of image. But Miss Marriage of the Financial Times had no idea what was going to happen here. Artista has some interesting clients. Ascot, for instance. And as I went through The Economist, Eurofighter Typhoon.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know why they would need these young ladies. Note the picture in the background. You might miss it by ICAP. Of course, you've got an interesting picture of a lady. And who else did we find? Well, we did come across the Air Force Charitable Trust had also apparently been using the same services.
Right.
So let's all put all this together. Here's the President's Club. We have an article which hammers them, but now this leads into the fact that men are touching up ladies everywhere, and this has got to be stopped. No mention of all those children's charities. No real admission that Artista was quite open in what it was recruiting the girls for. You can have a look at that yourself. But look at the prizes that the President's Club was able to offer. Tea with Mark Carney, Boris Johnson. So this is high-level connection with the governments. And what she does point out is Nadhim Zahawi, who's now the Parliamentary Under-Secretary, I think it's for children or families or education, but it's heading in the direction of young people. He was on the guest list. She can't say he was there, apparently, but he was on the guest list. So was there honest reporting in this article, Mike? I don't think so. I think this was following an agenda, which is to get people worked up over, this is more Westminster touching up. Nobody's doing anything with children. They're just putting hands up skirts. It's, yeah.
Yeah, the focus is on the sort of Me Too agenda and not on the fact that that sex was being used to raise money for children's charities. That's a pretty unpleasant combination, in my opinion.
Deeply unpleasant, I think.
Yep.
Where does that take us? Where have we got here?
Well,
civil service alumni.
This was just a throwaway comment. It was quite amusing. The civil service alumni were tweeting this out. They are getting ready for the second event in their AI series, which is AI, an ethical inquiry, and as you can see, it's a packed room. Again, the room is empty for anybody that's listening, by the way. This follows on from a debate that was held in Westminster Hall last week. We reported it, where the government was asking questions about ethics with the oncoming AI. Now, of course, government demonstrated that, or at least Parliament demonstrated that there's no interest in this subject because there were only 5 people in Westminster Hall last week. And the government spokesperson who was there demonstrated that really ethics and ethical issues are not close to the top of the agenda when it comes to AI. And if we look at the empty tables there, well, okay, I'm being a little bit naughty, I suppose, because nobody has arrived yet. But nonetheless, I do wonder how many people actually attended that.
Yeah, we don't know. Well, what can we end on? We'll say, first of all, that we're able to say today that the Doherty family, that some of our viewers and listeners will know about that case, we can say that they appear to be well. We're not able to report more because we don't have the information, but we know that there's been such concern amongst UK column viewers and listeners that we thought you would welcome that small piece of information. We've also received a letter from Melanie Shaw today. I've still to open that letter. Other people have been sending me her letters, and I'm going to say the position remains that Melanie Shaw, as a child abuse survivor and whistleblower, is still in prison. It seems her conditions have improved again at the moment, but she spent the bulk of 19 months in solitary confinement. This is the reality of Theresa May's Conservative government, abusing people who've been abused. We'll give you more detail on Melanie. We've also received another letter from somebody who's in prison, and I'm just going to say, if you're watching today, I have received that letter, which had a second-class stamp on it, so maybe you know who I'm talking to. I'm going to say to viewers and listeners who keep asking the question, but what can we do? It is up to you to challenge the press and media for their reporting, their fake news, the inaccuracies. And as Mike has just demonstrated, at the moment, they can't put in those algorithms to track what people are doing with sufficient accuracy to stop what could be an all-out push by good men and women, by every social media outlet possible, to challenge and expose what's going on. So really, it's up to us to keep pushing out the news, and we'll say it's up to our listeners and viewers to do everything they can to hold these people to account. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.